The Avengers vs. the Peter Factor by midnightwolf2192. Chapter 32. Field Trip Part 3. The Midtown students and their teachers were all staring in awe at the gathered Avengers. What they couldn't tell, however, was the barely controlled expressions of anger that each one was displaying. For example, Wanda was flexing and clenching her hands, while Akokie was casually tapping a finger on the shaft of her spear she was holding. Peter hoped, he knew it was in vain, but he could try, that no one would say anything stupid. "Welcome, Midtown," Steve said, obviously having been selected as the spokesman for the group. He and Sam stepped forward whilst the other members remained standing back in a line. They stopped just in front of the group and both men were smiling softly as their gazes fell onto Peter. "You have all been given the special privilege today of getting to witness an Avengers training session. We have special guests with us today as well. Princess Shuri of Wakanda and General Akokie, head of the Dora Milaje. Everyone has agreed to give you a little demonstration of their abilities and an explanation of to how they received them, and at the end there may even be some time for a hands-on demonstration." "Don't worry," Sam said, now addressing the concerned-looking teenagers, "we would never put the kids in any way of harm." "Now, let me introduce everyone," Steve said before turning to the gathered Avengers. "With us today are Princess Shuri and General Akokie, as I mentioned. We are also joined by Miss Wanda Maximoff, otherwise known as Scarlet Witch, Sergeant James Barnes, the White Wolf, Natasha Romanoff, the Black Widow, Sam Wilson, the Falcon, and myself. We thought we might start with a demonstration of Wanda's skills before moving down the line," Sam added, and the young woman stepped forward. And it was the first time Peter saw her smile as the people took a step away from her. "Thank you," Wanda said, turning back to the group. "My powers are the result of experiments conducted on me by the group known as Hydra. My brother and I were used as test subjects, and while he developed super speed, I developed telekinesis and energy manipulation." At the end of her little speech, she moved her hands and the group of teenagers all gasped excitedly as wisps of red energy moved between them. She manipulated the beams of energy much to the amazement of the teenagers. While this was happening, Peter felt someone rest against his side, and when he turned, he smiled down at Shuri. "Hey," Peter said, leaning down and, surprising both of them, kissed her on the forehead. "I would have thought you would be back in Wakanda." "Brother agreed to allow Akokie and I to come and demonstrate some of Wakanda's best fighting techniques to your classmates," Shuri said, and Peter raised an eyebrow at her. "It's true. He sends his best wishes. Also, Bandile sends his regards and wishes for you to come again when you are on your summer break. He told me to promise Mr. Stark that there will be no more trips into space." "I'll have to see what Mum and Dad say," Peter whispered, and Shuri nodded. She said hello to MJ and Ned before kissing Peter on the cheek and walking back to where Akokie was standing. The general nodded at him with a slight smirk, and Peter just rolled his eyes at the woman. He tuned back into the conversation just as Natasha stepped forward. "I am sure you all know who I am," Natasha opened with, and she smirked as the class all nodded in awe. "Well, Steve and I have to be nice and not frighten you, so there isn't much I can say about my skills, except that I was trained to be an assassin by an entity known as the Red Room. I learned skills that would terrify you. I hold those I care about close, and should any of them be harmed in any way, I have been known to take extreme action." By the end of her speech, her gaze was flickering solely towards Mr. Phillips and Flash. When she noticed Peter looking at her, her gaze softened slightly. "We will be discussing all of this later, my baby spider," Natasha said in Russian, and Peter nodded, a light blush crossing his cheeks. Uncle Bucky had obviously told her what he had heard in the lunchroom, so Peter knew there was no way he could get her out of that. The rest of the Avengers introduced themselves and their skills, and when they were all done, Steve took another step forward to address the teenagers. "Now, normally I would ask for a volunteer to participate in a demonstration," Steve commented, and while the teachers paled, the students all began to chatter excitedly. "However, none of you are covered to do that. None of your parents have consented, and you haven't signed any waivers of any kind." A loud groan echoed across the room, mixing with the sigh of relief from the teachers. Peter's groan continued longer than the others, however, when he noticed Steve looking intently at him. "Peter, however," he said with a smirk, and the whole class turned to face him. Peter has signed the necessary paperwork as part of his internship, and we have his guardian's permission. So, Pete, want to join us for a demonstration? Not really, Peter said, fixing a glare on this star-spangled man with a plan. I'd honestly rather watch one of your PSAs again, Spangles. Parker! Mr. Phillips said firmly, and the Avengers all tensed. You will respect Mr. Rogers, or you will return to the bus. Yes, sir, Peter drawled, channeling his inner Tony Stark. Bucky, who had let out a bark of laughter at Peter's comment, was now glaring fiercely at Mr. Phillips once more. Peter noticed something move on the man's neck, and he realised that Loki was currently shifted into a snake form and was wrapped around Bucky's neck. Well, this just got more interesting. I would prefer not to, Mr. Rogers, sir. Steve raised an eyebrow at the teen, but nodded in acceptance, instead encouraging Natasha and Bucky to move in onto the fighting mat. After a moment, Peter felt something slither up his leg, and he patted Loki on the back as the serpent made himself comfortable around the teenager's neck. Scared, Parker? Flash hissed while the rest of the group were distracted by the two fighting spies. Bet you are. I knew you were full of shit. Piss off, Flash! Peter burst out angrily, halting the fight and drawing the attention of everyone to him. But honestly, he didn't care. He was in his home, his safe space. How dare Flash continue to treat him like shit? Just shut the fuck up! Seriously, the only person who seems to give a shit about my internship is you. All day you've seen the signs that I work here, and still you can't get it through your thick skull that I do. I am a Stark intern. I do know the Avengers. What more do you want? Mr. Parker! Mr. Phillips yelled while everyone else stared in stunned silence at Parker. Even the Avengers. No one had ever expected Peter to lose his cool so spectacularly. All the Avengers had expected him to remain calm and collected until the end of the day, when he would no doubt unleash a wave of pranks on them for their involvement in his trip. His classmates had never once heard Peter raise his voice, let alone yell. He never stood up for himself, and he never fought back. Mr. Phillips stalked over to the teenager and gripped his arm firmly. I have had enough of your behaviour. First your constant lies, and now you are insulting and verbally harassing a fellow student. This is the final straw. You and I will be returning to the bus, and when we return to school, I will be calling your aunt. Jim, I assume you will back me up on this. You know what, sir? Just call her now. Peter all but yelled at the man as he wrenched his arm free. She's probably upstairs. I will not be returning to the bus. I am going to my lab. I have had enough of this bullshit. You say I'm lying? Fine. I don't give a shit what you think. You say I'm harassing students? Well, sir, I am simply responding in kind to the treatment I have been receiving since I started high school. Ned? MJ? I'll text you later. Without waiting for a response, Peter spun on his heel and stormed out of the room. He rode the elevator up to the lab he and Tony shared, and he walked in. Dummy came to life as Peter entered and raced over to the fuming teenager. Seemingly noticing the boy's mood, Dummy carefully led Peter over to the lounge and wrapped a blanket around him. Loki nuzzled Peter's neck while the boy took a few deep breaths to calm himself. The door to the lab opened and Peter felt someone sit beside him. Two arms wrapped around him, and he found himself moving to rest against Shuri. Are you okay? Shuri asked softly. Peter shook his head. Your teacher was out of line. Akokie had to escort Bucky and Natasha from the room once you left. White Wolf looked ready to kill. I can't do it anymore, Shuri, Peter admitted softly as a tear slipped down from his clenched cheeks. Loki rubbed his head against the boy's cheek, and Shuri let out a sigh. I'm just so goddamn over it all. Before Shuri could say anything, the door to the lab opened again, and two sets of footsteps were heard. Peter and Shuri looked up and noticed Pepper and Harley making their way towards them. Shuri took Loki from Peter's shoulders as Harley pulled his little brother into his arms for a tight hug. Pete, Pepper said, and Peter looked up at the woman from his position in Harley's arms. When she noticed his tears, she frowned. Oh, baby. I brought my potato gun with me, Harley commented, and Peter let out a walkery chuckle. I'm serious. Let me know who I'm practicing on. Pete, Friday showed us the footage, Pepper said, and Peter nodded. This can't continue. None of us can stand by and watch while this happens. I agree, Sherry and Harley chimed in, smirking at each other as their voices overlapped. Mum, I'm tired, Peter admitted, and Pepper pulled him into a hug. What can I do? Right now? Pepper asked, and when Peter nodded, a dangerous smile crossed her face. Now, we head to the conference room, where your classmates are waiting. The Avengers have a few things to show them. Peter looked at his mother in confusion, before allowing her to lead him and the others out of the lab. As they walked, Loki shifted back into his human form and took up a protective stance beside Peter. They rode the elevator to the conference floor, and Pepper led the small group into the conference room Alpha. Every eye turned to Peter, and it was then he noticed that every single Avenger was standing on the stage in front of the room. Pepper and Harley led the small group straight past the Midtown students, and only stopped when Mr. Phillips stood in front of them. Get out of my way, Pepper hissed. Then Peter watched as Loki conjured a small dagger. Parker, join the group, Phillips said, ignoring the visibly furious CEO in front of him. We will discuss your behaviour when we return to the school. Get out of my way, Pepper said again, her voice never raising in volume, but her intent clear. As Loki took a step forward, Phillips's gaze turned to him and the man paled. John, sit down, Principal Morita said, and the teacher in question stared between Pepper and his boss, before reluctantly retaking his seat again. Pepper nodded at the other man before leading the group up onto the stage. Nebula instantly attached herself to Peter's other side, while she and Loki led the team over to where Natasha and Bucky were standing. Now that we have all arrived, Tony said, his best paparazzi smile firmly in place as he spoke. Welcome, Midtown. I would say it's a pleasure to have you here, but I've got to be honest, it hasn't really. What Tony means to say, Steve interjected, and Tony just rolled his eyes, is that some of your group have demonstrated some rather unsavoury behaviour throughout today's tour. But we decided it would be unfair to punish the whole group simply because of the actions of a few. You decided, Capsicle, Tony said, and Steve shook his head with a smirk. But Capsicle is right. Some of you in here have demonstrated to your tour guide and the scientists that you actually have brains in your heads, and so the Avengers have granted you a special Q&A session. Now, since I assume that as teenagers you all know how to raise your hands, raise your hand if you have a question, and we will see how many we can get through before I get too bored. Peter tuned out of the Q&A session, instead focusing on Nebula's fingers running through his hair. He could feel the glares from Flash and Mr. Phillips, but chose to ignore them. He only turned back in when he heard the bully mention his name. So, I'll bite and say that Parker does indeed have an internship here, Flash sneered, and Peter glared at the other team. But why him? I mean, he's nothing special. He's not even that smart. Nothing special? Tony hissed out softly as the other Avengers all took a joint, sharp breath. Flash, not realizing how much trouble he was in, nodded his head. Peter Parker is the smartest person in this room, bar none, Bruce surprisingly interjected, leaning over to rest a hand on the teen's shoulder. He has been working here for over a year now, and most of the more recent developments and patents have his name attached in some way. He works with Dr. Jane Foster and Dr. Eric Selvig on their studies of Einstein-Rosen bridges and other astrophysics concepts you could only dream about, Tony added sharply. Dr. Hank Pym consults with Peter on entomology and physics, and Peter has helped with Dr. Pym's analysis of the quantum realm. Peter is one of the few non-Wakandan people to have been allowed into the science labs in Wakanda, and our scientists frequently consult with him, Shuri added, and Peter felt his cheeks flush. He is also the only person other than myself allowed to touch anything within my private lab. No projects move forward without Pete casting an eye over it, Ari chimed in from her place on the other side of the stage, and Peter glared at her. Even scientists with decades of experience look to Pete for advice. So, the question isn't why him, it's why not? Pepper finished, and Flash was openly gaping at the group. Peter is the reason Loki is standing on this stage and not being murdered by the Avengers. When I say that Peter is worth more than anyone else in this room, I mean it. Hell, Peter is the reason Capsicle and I get along again after what the media has affectionately termed the Avengers Civil War. Tony added, his gaze narrowing and his tone turning sharp. We have been watching you all day, Mr. Eugene Thompson. You have taken every step imaginable to try and bring Peter down. We know about all the instances of your bullying. The only reason you are standing here is because Peter wouldn't allow us to interfere. Natasha commented, her tone deadly. The teenager paled, and Nat smirked at him. But not anymore. I will not allow you to threaten my student. Phillips tried to interject, and Natasha's glare moved to him. Don't even get me started on you. We will be dealing with you later, Nat said before turning back to Flash. You think popularity in high school means anything in the real world? All you have proven today is that you are unable to work in a team. You have proven that you are unnecessarily jealous of others, and instead of trying to learn from them, you are intent on belittling them and bringing them down. That will get you nowhere in the real world, as Natasha said, Pepper added, and Flash paled further. Pepper nodded her head, and Happy and two of the security team stepped in. Mr. Thompson, as of right now, you have been barred from any Stark Industries location, including any of our subsidiaries. Instead of this being a lifetime ban, as many here would prefer, I have decided that this ban will be in effect for 5 years. If, after that time, you can demonstrate that you have grown up and matured, you may be allowed back on Stark-owned premises. Until then, our security team will escort you from this building. I will not allow them to take this student without a responsible adult, Pete Phillips said, and Pepper smiled at him. Don't worry. You will be joining him, Pepper said, and the man gaped. You have shown a distinct lack of care for those in your charge. You have a duty to care and provide all of your students with a safe learning environment, and instead we have seen evidence of you turning a blind eye to the blatant bullying occurring under your nose. As such, Mr. John Phillips, you two are banned from Stark Industries locations and her subsidiaries. Happy moved over to the man and indicated for him to follow, the look on the head of security's face leaving no room for arguments. Flash gaped as he and Phillips were herded out from the room. Pepper turned to Principal Marita and her face softened. Jim, may we speak privately? Pepper asked, and the man nodded. Pepper kissed the side of Peter's head as she walked past, and Tony returned to his place at the podium. Now that that's all out of the way, any more questions for us? Tony asked, his shoulders relaxing and a smile crossing his face. As Peter watched Betty stand and ask a question for the female Avengers, Peter leaned back into Nebula's arms. Sure, school was probably going to suck next week, but at least Peter knew he had one hell of a support team behind him. End of chapter, and end of the Avengers versus the Peter Factor. Hi guys, hope you enjoyed this. Thank you so much for sticking with me through this. It's been absolutely amazing. I love you all, and thank you so much. Just again, yes, just yes. All of that, yes, the Avengers going to ball. A little bit of romance between Shuri and Peter. But admittedly, normally I ship MJ with Peter, but Shuri's a good one if they're not a pair, so I'm not fussed. And there is something I would like to say. Midnight Wolf 2192, you are a legend. Thank you so much. For those of you who do not know and haven't read the actual story, she mentions me at the note at the bottom of this chapter. Let me read it aloud. End of part 1. Thank you all for joining me on this amazing adventure. I simply cannot believe how much traction this story has gotten. It is even being made into an incredible audiobook by the wonderful PJ's Reads on YouTube. Seriously, go and listen. I mean, what the heck? Thank you so much. Just thank you. Just, oh my flipping god. Yes. Thank you. Thank you, thank you, thank you. Sorry, I know I'm fangirling, but yeesh. Anyway, there will be a sequel to this, she has said. He, non-binary, don't care. Anyway, so I will also be doing sub-stories for this, as there are 2. One of them being Grandparents' Day and another one being someone trying to trick the Peter Tingle like trying to trick the Spidey sense. So I will be doing those very soon, I promise. I'm sorry I haven't recorded it straight off the bat when it was first published. A, I did not know it had been published yet, and B, I'm recovering from a cold, so I wanted my voice to be in top form. Anyway, remember to like, comment and subscribe, and hit that bell to get notified whenever I upload a new video. Have a good day, night, or whatever time zone you're in. Bye my gals and non-binary pals. I'll see you in another video. Bye!